Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be a webinar about how we can turn war into peace. We'll be talking with three poets, actually, who also happen to be students of AMI and students of yoga science, and three other very learned students. These are all people who work with resolving inner conflict. This seminar is not about particularly changing the world in an outward sense, but in changing the world through inner work, obliterating our own conflicts, and thereby being able to serve a higher resolution in everything that comes before us. The recognizing and resolving our individual inner conflicts is essential to reducing humanity's destructive outer conflicts. And as we listen to the testimony of these 6 students, we'll see how in very different ways, in differing ways, working with the inner conflict brings joy to you and to all of your relationships. And we're going to be talking about all kinds of relationships. Thank you.
We decided to begin tonight's webinar by sharing a video trailer from the new book, Your Conscience. Because your conscience is your most powerful and practical resource for helping turn war into peace. So let's take a look together. I wrote this book to address a crisis in education. Many of us, no matter when we graduated from high school, were only educated to memorize and recite information. Perhaps a truly skilled teacher taught us critical thinking skills. But it is highly unlikely that we learn to develop the practical and creative tools that reliance on the conscience can provide. As a result, we are ignorant of our own innate, brilliant human capacity to make the wise and kind decision in every circumstance. The conscience gives us the confidence to know what's to be done and what's not to be done, no matter what challenge we face. But our ignorance of the power of the conscience blinds us and leads to suffering. The relentless onslaught of information from our mobile devices, cable news, emails, and social media feeds adds yet another layer of stress and anxiety we are not equipped to manage. At an alarming rate, bits of new data challenge our security and titillate our pleasure centers in our brain, driving us to make snap decisions that lead to fear, anger, disease, and even death. Technology may have changed how we were taught and how we stay connected to one another, but it has not addressed this serious deficit in our collective education. At this auspicious moment, an openness to embracing new and old ideas from beyond our present cultural matrix can bring us the sustenance and growth we desperately need and desire. Our modern American culture now faces a golden opportunity to go beyond its impoverished rigidity, superstition, blind customs, and dogma to attain the spiritual and philosophical wealth necessary to solve all of life's challenges. Today, a new reliance on our conscience as our guide can make it possible for each of us to access and integrate intuitive wisdom and to establish greater personal security, creativity, and peace of mind. As we experiment with the profound gifts of the conscience to determine our thoughts, words, and deeds, we are destined to become both prophets and beneficiaries of our own superconscious wisdom. For this noble endeavor, learning how to use the infinite resources of the conscience is not simply a good idea, it is a dire necessity.
So you have the power to change the world. Let me just repeat that. You have the power to change the world, one thought at a time, from within the constellation of your own personal relationships. These relationships that each of us have, they're not accidents. They're divinely orchestrated to bring us exactly what we need in order to resolve our inner conflict. And as a consequence, as we lessen the conflict in our own consciousness, it changes the consciousness of the planet, because there is only one consciousness, here, there, and everywhere. So to help us, we have 5 steps to turn war into peace. The first, it's critically important that we understand the law of karma. The law of karma, and we're very familiar with it, maybe from Newton's third law of motion. Thoughts lead to words and deeds, and cumulative, the thoughts, the words, and the deeds lead to consequences. So we are fortunate at this time because we already know the consequence that we want to experience, don't we? We want to experience peace. Then the question becomes, how are we going to get to point B from point A? And that would take another step. We need to realize that all reality flows from the subtle to the gross. That might be a strange sounding phrase. All reality flows from the subtle to the gross. What does that mean? Well, thoughts are subtle. They're mental. They're in the mind, not in the world. That's subtle. And from that subtle force of our thoughts, words appear. We speak and we do things. Our deeds all flow from thoughts. And the words and the deeds and the thoughts cumulatively create consequences. That's critically important to understand. That underscores the power of our thoughts. Therefore, if all outer conflict, including war, is seen as a gross manifestation of pre-existing subtle inner conflict, then we have something to build on. All outer conflict, such as the war, must be seen as a gross manifestation of pre-existing subtle inner mental conflict. So therefore, without subtle inner mental conflict, outer gross conflict cannot just spontaneously manifest pain in the body or even war in the world. Because all reality flows from the subtle to the gross. If there's conflict in the mind, that inner conflict is the mother of all problems, all pain, all war. If you eliminate the inner conflict, you eliminate the outer conflict. Step 3, we have to rely on our own conscience 24/7 in thought, word, and deed. And the more that you eliminate your own subtle inner conflict by basing your thoughts, your words, and your deeds on the superconscious wisdom of your conscience, and I'll talk more about both of those in a moment, then your brilliant mind can help turn war into peace. Step 4, we need to understand and coordinate the 4 functions of the mind. Really? Yes, we need to understand and coordinate the 4 functions of the mind. Most of us growing up never even knew that there were 4 functions of the mind. Oh, we surmised that there are different voices in our mind, but we never actually knew that there were 4 functions. But why? Why is it so important to understand that and to coordinate them? What does that mean? Well, it's important because all reality flows from the subtle to the gross, as we've just discussed. Thoughts lead to speech and action that lead to consequences. The mind moves first through thoughts, and the body follows with speech and action. Since we desire peace, as we do, we must coordinate the mind, those subtle forces, so that our thoughts and then our words and deeds reduce inner conflict and therefore lead us to experience peace. So we need to learn to coordinate the 4 functions of the mind. First, we have to be introduced to the 4 functions of the mind and understand them. Then we can access and benefit from their superconscious wisdom, which lies at the core of our being, what we euphemistically refer to as our soul, that part of the supreme intelligence we refer to as God that is within us, that is us having this human experience. Well, as I said, we have 4 functions of the mind that move before speech and before our deeds that lead to consequences. Now, 3 of the 4 are just advisors. They have no power to make a decision. They're like lobbyists. Each of them is important, but each of them has limitations. They have limited perspectives. So the unconscious, for example, these are our memories and our habits. Sometimes the unconscious habits that we have stored are very helpful, but a lot of times, much of what is stored in the unconscious mind represents unskillful actions that we have accepted from other people. You know, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, friends, celebrities, politicians, the culture. So the unconscious, just like the senses and the ego, these other advisors, they're often wrong, but never in doubt. That's one of the 4 functions, an advisor, the unconscious. Then the senses. The senses also advise us what's to be done and what's not to be done through the organs of sense, of sight and smell and taste, hearing and touch, so that you and I, from wherever we are, can engage the world to find something that's going to make me happy, something that's going to bring me security and pleasure. So again, the senses only have a limited perspective, often wrong, but never in doubt. So they're not always wrong. We have a body. We have senses. Life is to be enjoyed. But that which the senses are suggesting right now, is it going to lead to the resolve and the diminution of inner conflict, or is it only going to create more inner conflict? And the third advisor, the third of the four functions, which can only advise, is the ego. And the ego is all about self-preservation. You know, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Now, the ego interjects itself in every decision making with its advice, because it creates things like things that it says, I like, let's reprise it, that's pleasant. And it also creates the notion of things that we should dislike, because the ego defines it as unpleasant or bad. So good and bad are two concepts the ego has coined, all in an attempt to convince us that its limited perspective is always correct and will always save us. So you have the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind. They are the advisors trying to make sure that what actually happens through speech and action is in service to their limited perspective. But none of those three functions, ego, senses, or unconscious mind, can make a decision. But the conscience can. The conscience is the only function of the mind that can make a decision. And it can also reflect superconscious wisdom. So the conscience can make one of two kinds of choices. If you and I do not train and parent the ego, senses, and unconscious mind and coordinate them in service to the conscience when it reflects superconscious wisdom, then the conscience can only make one form of a decision, and that is it can only rubber stamp the loudest voice it can hear. And that's what gets us in a lot of trouble, creates a lot of inner conflict, and brings pain into our lives. But if you and I can begin to experiment with small, seemingly insignificant no-brainers, to experiment with using the conscience and coordinating the ego, senses, and unconscious mind, then we can train and parent the ego, senses, and unconscious mind after they have presented their limited perspectives. We can train them to quiet down. And when they finally become quiet, in that quietude of an even mind, the conscience can hear the whisper from the superconscious portion of the mind, this perfect wisdom that can enlighten us as regards to the thought to think, the word to speak, and the action to take that will lead us and humanity for our collective and individual highest and greatest good. But we need to understand and we need to coordinate it. It's our work in the world, regardless of the field of action, whether it's personal or professional or even recreational. We're still making choices. We still are reaping consequences. So if we really have a desire for peace, that will become our work in every relationship, so that the conscience can reflect the superconscious wisdom. The fifth step, as you can imagine, is simply to practice, practice, practice. And it's up to you, it's up to each of you to help turn war into peace by reducing your own mind's inner conflict. Everything counts. The fact that there's a war means that we have already added to the inner conflict, and we have not done enough, in part because we just did not know. We came upon it honestly. And now we know. We know that we need to understand the law of karma, that thoughts lead to words and deeds and consequences. We know that we want a consequence of peace, so we have to remember that all reality flows from the subtle to the gross. The mind moves first, the body follows. Consequence flows from that. And we have to rely on our conscience 24/7 to make appropriate choices based on superconscious wisdom, not the loudest voice of the other four. So we need to understand in step 4 and coordinate the 4 functions of the mind. And we have to do this practice. We have to do this practice. We have to do this practice because it's up to each of us. So to provide a few diverse perspectives on how everyday circumstances can help you turn war into peace, we've invited 6 yoga scientists to share the kinds of experiments that they have undertaken. Thank you.
We invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A part, the bottom of your screen. We will be entertaining those questions as time allows. So please, if anything's on your mind, let us know. We're going to begin our first presentation with John. John is a teacher who's been working with his conscience. John?
Thank you. I've been a student of yoga science at AMI for about 3 years now. And for me, unlimited exposure to the news too often results in uncontrollable thoughts and unskilled words and actions, in particular regarding the war in Ukraine. My experiment on this specific issue has been to limit my exposure to the news in order to limit the extent of my mental conflict on the subject, simply by not thinking about it constantly. Mental conflict produced by dwelling on thoughts and images of this war and the devastation to the Ukrainian people is so painful to me because I identify with Ukrainians intimately. I am an American of pure Ukrainian descent. I may well have blood relatives suffering and dying in this war. So this war story leads me to a very dark and disturbing mental place. My yoga science practice has relieved much of that pain that I could be suffering if I were to stay in the mental conflict. One result of this experiment has manifested in my choice of action. From the beginning of this war, I felt I needed to act, to contribute to a solution. At first, I looked for ways to support the war effort, to fund arms, ammunition to Ukraine, to crush the evil invaders. After clearing my mind in meditation and consulting the conscience, I realized those were ego thoughts, Preya to be sacrificed, and that more skillful action would be to fund humanitarian aid, medical supplies, food, and water to help the Ukrainian people, not to contribute to the violence. And so that's what I've done and what I will continue to do. But I must say that through yoga science teachings, it has become clear to me that this experiment is only the tip of the iceberg. It's a lightning rod for much deeper, more entrenched, and even common everyday habits and attachments that result in conflict in my mind and pain in my experience. It's easy for me to comprehend how being exposed to and being consumed by horrific reports and images of war causes me pain and suffering. And it's easy for me to understand that everyday simple choices that I make for myself can also lead to my peace or conflict and suffering. The connection between all my thoughts, all my relationships, and the collective consciousness is real, and that the state of the collective consciousness can result in either war or peace. Wow. I believe the teachings to be true, that every prayer I serve leads to conflict within me, and that our collective conflict can lead to war. And so I'm energized to continue the practice, to continue to experiment with my everyday choices, to sacrifice the prayer, to serve the Shreya, to reduce conflict in my mind, to suffer less. And while it is phenomenal to me, I trust that my contribution to the collective consciousness can turn war into peace. Namaste. I acknowledge the divinity and peace in you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we'll have a slightly different perspective. I mentioned earlier that we have 3 poets in this group, and our first poet is Jessica.
Namaste. I'm happy to be here. One simple and straightforward experiment that brought me a significant shift in perspective involved taking walks. It was last spring, and still being fairly new to this practice, I wanted to start experimenting with something small, something manageable. I had always tended, as long as I can remember, to become reclusive, to stay inside and succumb to depressive moods from time to time. And I had recently learned from AMI's teachings that when in a tamasic or heavy emotional weather pattern, one should do something rajasic, an action that is selfless, sort of as an equalizer. So accordingly, I decided I would respond to toxic depressive moods with a slightly brisk outdoor walk. Now, my ego was dubious that something so simple could transform a lifelong tendency, but I assured the ego that we were simply going to give it a try. I wasn't committing to a lifelong depression remedy. I would simply respond to my lowest moods with walks for a few days and see what happens. So the next time I found myself curling up and feeling low and sad and overwhelmed by the world, like a lot of people feel now, I mustered the energy to put on my shoes, step outside, and just begin walking. At first, it felt laborious and completely out of sync with my thoughts and my feelings. But after several minutes, the personality started to forget its sadness and fall into sync with the moment. The breath started to deepen and my stride slowly, naturally increased. The breeze, the bird songs, and the body movement lifted my spirit from the clutches of the story I had been telling myself for years. I'm sad. I can't engage with the world right now. Not only could I engage, but that engagement was precisely the remedy for the sadness. After experimenting for a few days with the walks, the ego, the unconscious mind, and the senses resisted less and less because they all benefited from these walks. Now the functions of the mind coordinate to take beneficial walks, as they all know from experience how much they have to offer. Also, this very basic and simple starting point for experimenting had a significant impact on my moods and my relationships. Like a pebble in the pond, This small experiment doesn't just elevate my moods, it contributes to the world. Every effort toward personal growth benefits us all and also gives us the confidence, as it did for me, to take on many more and sometimes much more challenging experiments. And that has dramatically improved the quality of my life and my increasingly peaceful relationships in the world.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we'll hear from the second of our poets, Bob.
Good evening, everybody. Several weeks ago, I attended via Zoom the American Meditation Institute's weekly meditation and discussion with Lev and Jenness Perlmutter, and a question arose: how can I, just one person, make a difference in changing the world? And it was in reference to the ongoing war. And his analogy was a great one, so I wanted to share it with you. He said that our inner conflict collectively has manifested as outer conflict as war. And then in response to another person's question, he presented an analogy of making soup. If you add soup to the salt, he said, it changes the whole soup. Maybe just a little bit at first, but it has changed. And if you keep adding more and more salt, you eventually begin to taste the difference. So that's it. We must start by resolving our own inner conflict, by basing our outer actions on our own inner wisdom, and by doing what's to be done and not doing what's not to be done, thus resolving that inner conflict. And collectively start adding our salt, our love to a conflicted world. In closing, this was a post I had posted, so it's really not closing yet. I'll leave you with the immortal words of the late, great President John F. Kennedy Jr. One person can make a difference, and everyone should try. And my experiment, since listening in on that satsang, I had an awakening. I knew all about the functions of the mind. I know how to coordinate them. I've been in this practice for 20 years, but knowing without doing is of little use. And I have been letting the ego, the unconscious, and the senses run the show. Every time I got to a yellow light, I would speed up instead of slowing down and just letting the ego take control. And as a result, I have been in inner conflict. I have never given how much thought to how incredibly important it is to slow the mind down and coordinate these four functions as to prevent this building up of my inner conflict, this, for a harsh word, but daily murdering of my conscience and having it overflow out into the world. Since that day, I have begun to re-engage my conscience in coordination with the other functions as to help me decide what's to be done and what's not to be done, mostly revolving around one of the primitive fountains, and that would be of eating and food. Over the past few years, I have been letting the ego masquerade as the conscience, rationalizing, you eat better than 95% of the population. You work out 4 times a week, you meditate, you do yoga, you're a good person, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, you should be able to eat whatever you want, whenever you want. And that's not true. I have to be discriminating like everyone else. I have put on the proverbial quarantine 15, and my asthma has been out of control. So I, as an experiment, began to hunker down when it comes to food and eating food that truly honors and loves my body. As an experiment, I began coordinating the functions of the mind and making those discriminating choices, slowing it down, not busting through the yellow light, but slowing down and stopping at that intersection of choice and taking the time to coordinate these functions and do what was best, what was to be done and what was not to be done whenever I ate. And it's paying off. In just 3 weeks now, I'm already down 5 pounds. My energy levels are increasing. I feel great when I'm working out, and I just feel better overall. And that my dependence on the inhaler is so much less, more than 50% in just 3 weeks, when I was really relying on it to get through those months. And probably last and most important, I don't feel at war with myself. And when you're not at war with yourself, you're at peace. And when you're at peace, the world is one step closer to being at peace. And I'd like to share a few poems. I'm glad to see other poets on here as well. I love that. And we'll talk later. But the first one is about adding our salt, our love to the soup. And these are short and brief and to the point. First one is called Simple Fix. It's a simple fix. One by one, add our love to the mix. And then the other one is called the real genius. And this is regarding coordinating the functions of the mind. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. If you don't coordinate these functions of the mind, you can be smart as anything, but that inner conflict will build and it will manifest out into the world. So this is called the real genius, the real intelligence, I call it. When you know what to do with a thought of anger or with a thought of fear, to me, that is the real genius, knowing how to steer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Excellent. You
Thank
are you are the salt of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Our next presenter is Veronica, who's been experimenting close to home. Veronica?
Yes, namaste. I
Namaste.
have been attending AMI's Sunday meditation for 8 months, and I attended the foundations class in February. And for the benefit of my mind-body complex, I am at the same time experimenting with food choices, diaphragmatic breathing, and also strengthening relationships. My body and mind have definitely reaped the rewards of better food choices and the benefits of proper breathing. I am doing that for improved relaxation, and also I have hopes that it will help my asthma. But my greatest rewards have resulted from my experimentation with my relationships, with my immediate family, close friends, extended family, so forth. I am now experimenting for the first time. I think he'll be 44 this year. I'm experimenting with trusting my adult son and also a granddaughter and another teenager in my house. I'm trying to trust them, to let them to be themselves, to find their own way for what they need. And that's not something that I had ever done before. I was always dictating and trying to control every move they made. But now I've come to realize that my ego and unconscious mind has caused my idea of love to be more about my fears of my loved ones making poor decisions, and then that would cause them pain, and then subsequently I would be in pain. And I was really trying to avoid my own pain. But now I am allowing my conscience to consult with the superconscious wisdom to best inform my thoughts, words, and deeds when relating to my loved ones. My conscience, after consulting with the superconscious wisdom, leads me to experience a different type of love for the first time in my life. It's a love that is not based on my memories or on my past habits of criticizing and giving advice and worrying about what's going to happen to somebody else. My conscious now is experimenting with detachment, and it's beautiful. It's nice to be able to love, but not constantly be in fear and worry about the pain that others will go through because of life, their life. So I'm trying to love them for who they are and not trying to make them a reflection of me. I am coming to realize that I don't have to take on their pain. They can be in pain, grow from their mistakes without me suffering along with them. My past unskilled behaviors as a result of my ego, logic, and unconscious mind were also extended to my sisters and brothers. And I have a few of them and other close relationships. In the past, not having the skill to allow my conscience to consult my higher wisdom, this personality has been extremely opinionated, judgmental, and unskillful. And this unskillful behavior has led to a lot of conflict and stress and ill feelings with my siblings and other close relationships, people who I love the most and love me, but it hasn't been a beautiful thing. But now I was making these unskilled decisions. It was based on my logic and my habits and my ego. And I once seemed so justified in what I believed and what I was trying to tell people, that I knew what was best for them. And I insisted that they accept my opinions as their truth. And it never works. Now I am experimenting with the superconscious wisdom guiding my conscience to genuinely try to listen to others, even if this personality doesn't agree with them. I try to be patient. I'm trying to continue to listen, even if what they're saying is painful. And I have sisters in particular who can dredge up the past and say very painful things, but I'm trying to be able to be detached and handle that and still be loving and patient. And I'm experimenting with my conscious, staying in touch with my feelings, so I don't go into the raging that I have done so much in the past, and I don't let my emotions overflow and everything gets out of control. I am experimenting with allowing my conscience to consult with my higher wisdom, to practice ahimsa, so that my words and actions don't cause injury to my loved ones nor to me. I am experimenting with giving my love freely, even if it takes more effort. The biggest reward of my experimenting with my interactions with my loved ones thus far has been that I have been able to be more peaceful rather than stressful and hurtful with them. It has been extremely joyful for me and for my loved ones that we're having closer and more loving bonds. It causes me to feel more love radiating from them because I believe they feel more love radiating from me. So rather than to continue to live my life fumbling in the dark, I am experimenting with coordinating the 4 functions of the mind and letting my conscience shine a light on the path to follow. And so far, this has been beautiful for me and for my relationships. I want to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. That's beautiful. So you can see everybody has different kinds of relationships with which we experiment. And that's perfect. That's just perfect. And we don't have to do anything really grandiose or theatrical. It can be small because everything counts. If I can reduce inner conflict even in a small way, it adds up. It's just like banking.
And it's not just for your life, it's for the life of the world. Thank you, Veronica. And now our third poet, Andre, is going to talk about how he has benefited from listening to his conscience.
Hello. The story I will briefly share has to do with an ongoing experiment about being aware of the invitation for presence and to be carried into the unfolding experience of whatever that might be, positive or negative. This one happens to be a very positive experience. It's back in the winter, the middle of winter, and I had an appointment for service on my automobile, which took me about an hour and a half away from my home. It was early morning, and as I was driving, the sun was clear, the sky was blue, there was no wind, the temperature was probably 5 to 6 degrees. I arrived at the service dealership. My car was serviced in a timely, professional manner, which I deeply appreciated. And from there, I found a place to have a delightful lunch. And I drove back through beautiful country in Western Massachusetts, woods, serene pastures, hills, mountains in the distance. And as I was driving, I came upon a lake, a beautiful lake, which was glistening in the sunlight. The sun was shining down on the frozen surface of this lake. It was sparkling. There was trees around the shoreline in the distance. The sun was perfectly clear. And inside of me, I felt an internal pull to stop and get out and explore. But because the insistent, noisy voices of the ego, the senses, and unconscious mind were opposed to stopping, it was impossible for the conscience to hear the quiet whisper of advice from the superconscious mind. And as a result, the conscience endorsed their limited perspectives that I should continue driving, passing the frozen lake without further ado. But while continuing my drive, the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind let their guard down just for a moment and became quiet long enough for the conscience to prompt me with a whisper to turn around and go back to that frozen pond to explore. Following the wisdom reflected by the conscience, I turned the car around, went back to the pond. I parked the car on the side and got out. I surveyed the surrounding area and the ice surface. I deemed the ice thick enough and rambled out onto it. I was the only human being on the lake, and I started walking towards the center. The sun was shining, the trees were silent, the air was quiet. I felt within me the urge to quicken my pace, and I kept accelerating, and I started running. It was just something inside of me to run, just to be aware, to be free out there. And wouldn't you know it, as time went on, the gifts, the invitation that I listened to started to present themselves. I started noticing the structures within the ice below my feet, all these incredible designs, cracks, bits of snow that had made these incredible formations. I noticed the forest along the shoreline as they stood silently, majestically, without words, without anything. I saw the sky, the clouds that were sort of whispering across the horizon very gently. And there was this inner peace within me. There was this presence as I stood there in the middle of the pond with no other human being there, that I knew I was one with that I belonged. And it was a moment of grace. It was exuberance, it was joy, and it was openness, for which I was so grateful. So that's my story of listening to the conscience and being aware of an invitation to be present. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaidev.
Thank you. And now a word from Jennifer about a matter of physical well-being. Let's hear your experiment, Jennifer.
Good evening, everyone. I am going to tell you about my battle with potato chips and what it has taught me about conflict and also about my own mind. So I need to give you just a little bit of background. About 2.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. RA is a disease where the body's immune system attacks the fluid around the joints. And I'm really fortunate. I was never in any pain, but I mentioned that my fingers were a little bit stiff to my doctor on a routine visit. And she ordered a blood test that showed that my body was in fact inflamed. So a few months later, a specialist, a rheumatologist, prescribed a powerful drug to suppress my immune system. This was the standard treatment, was what I was told. I didn't like the idea of messing with my immune system though, so I bought a book about non-pharmaceutical approaches to managing RA. I was skeptical at first, but what I was reading made sense to me. So I found a functional medicine doctor who advised me to cut out sugar, dairy, and gluten from my diet. I did that, and almost immediately my symptoms resolved. I also felt more energetic and clear-headed than I had in years. And this is the doctor who pointed me in the direction of AMI and to whom I will always be grateful. So giving up sugar, dairy, and gluten wasn't easy for me. I really, really missed cheese, but I did it. And I did it cold turkey because I saw it as a matter almost of life and death. I did not want to compromise my immune system, but I also didn't want to suffer from this really, from this disease that can be crippling. So I found the willpower to make these major changes because my desire for self-preservation was so strong. What I've discovered since then, though, is that it's the choices that I make that don't appear to have such significant consequences. Those choices have proven to be even more fertile territory for the ongoing work that I have to do in coordinating the 4 functions of my mind. So here's what happened. After changing my diet so drastically with the sugar and the gluten and the dairy, I very quickly formed an attachment to potato chips. I rationalized this, or should I say my ego rationalized it, by telling myself I deserved it, kind of like Bob said, you know, if I could no longer eat some of my favorite foods and I was eating so well, I could at least treat myself to a handful of potato chips every now and again. So my taste buds, my senses were very happy with this. But after a few months, my conscience knew that I needed to cut back. I can just tell you that I was eating a lot of potato chips, way more than just a few handfuls every now and again. So I would let my supply run out, and then I'd find myself standing in the snack aisle at the grocery, and I would give in to the chorus of voices in my head saying things like, what the heck, you do such a good job with everything else. How bad can a few potato chips be? Remember how much mom loved potato chips. You're just channeling her. That was one of my favorites. I really latched onto that one. What's the big deal? These are made with avocado oil. How bad can they be? Eventually, though, I couldn't ignore the voice of my conscience. I knew I was eating too many, and I knew that they were not good for me. So one day, I just stopped. It was just over. The rationalizations had lost their power. The conscience won, and everybody else, the ego, the senses, and even the unconscious mind just gave up, at least in this particular field of action. And I felt better for it. The real value in this experiment, though, has been what it's taught me about how my own mind works. I've come to recognize that my ego, senses, and unconscious mind, they actually try to run the same plays in many other situations and relationships, not just with food, but with people also, with my relationships. And it's especially when the stakes appear to be lower than they were when I got that diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. When the stakes are low, that's when my ego really goes to work. It's quite clever, and it knows just what to say when it's about to get overruled by my conscience. I like to think that I'm falling for it less frequently now, but I can't really say that for sure. I can say for sure that I'm trying. And I'm also more aware, I'm becoming more aware that just because I can't see the consequences doesn't mean that they're not real. So I'd like to close by noting also that when I do make a good choice, when I do listen to my conscience, I'm also getting better at recognizing how that feels. Like that moment when I finally quit the potato chips, or when I refrain from saying something hurtful in a challenging discussion. Those are the moments when I feel aligned. And when I do that, I feel expansive, as opposed to conflicted or constricted or fearful or guilty. Instead, it's a beautiful, spacious feeling, and it's so different from the feeling that I have when my actions are not aligned with my inner wisdom. And I'm finally starting to believe, because I have now experienced it directly, what our teacher, Ram Lev, has been telling us, and what he just said a few moments ago, that it's these small choices, when the conscience gets the win, that they build on each other and they make the next choice easier. It's easier to make, it's easier to hear the voice of the conscience and to make the best choice. And it feels sort of like the other parts of my mind have learned that when I listen and when I heed the voice, that quiet voice of the conscience, that's when I'm at my best. That's when I can be my most loving, and my most generous to everyone, to all beings, including myself. Thank you so much. Namaste.
I would just like to add just one thing to that, and that is that the conscience is not the only winner here. We are complicated animals. We are holistic animals. And it is just as much my work to love others as it is to love my ego with the limited perspective that it has. It must be my work to love and joy, to love the senses and the unconscious mind, so that they all can be winners, so that they can expand their limited perspectives and experience a new way of being, the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. It's been inspiring to hear the very different ways that you are working with this practice. And I hope that everyone in our audience can have an inspiration of new ways to work with it. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that are very similar, asking about the effect of meditating with the intention of changing the world, of changing the consciousness of the world. And of course, that is a noble way to use one's energy, and it probably does have good effects. But I think it's important to recognize that this is an inside job. We can obliterate the energies that are destructive if we can transform the energy of our own mind from its unhelpful habits into helpful habits. We are, all of us, working for peace, not only our inner peace, but when we work for that inner peace, it is affecting everyone. So I would recommend that as the first step. We can pray for peace. We can meditate with the intention of increasing peace in the world. But the most important work that we do is changing that subtle energy within ourselves into a power for peace.
And so finally, I want to say that the 5 steps to turn war into peace underscores the power of everyone's everyday personal relationships. Today, we pray that you consider this webinar as an open invitation to join us on this important and historic journey to help turn war into peace. If you feel at the present time you'd like to deepen your understanding of these 5 steps and the teaching associated with it, I encourage you to consider attending the foundation course at AMI. For that, just visit the AMI homepage at americanmeditation.org, where you will be able to receive all of the details. On behalf of Jenness and on behalf of all of the students and faculty at the American Meditation Institute, I want to thank everybody for your attention. And I pray that you're inspired to look at your own mind, become a true friend of your ego, your senses, your unconscious mind, and parent them, train them, so that they can expand their limited perspectives and turn war into peace. Thank you for joining us. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. I pray to the divinity in you.
Namaste.